While we start in Australia, where Google has threatened to switch off its search engine should a new law come into force that would make it pay for showing local news articles on its site. The government of Prime Minister Scott Morrison argues that since Google profits from linking to news providers, the search engine should pay for the journalism. It is a debate reflected all over the world. Let's hear first from Google's Australian director, Mel Silver, arguing against the new law.
If this version of the code were to become law, it would give us no real choice but to stop making Google Search available in Australia. In its current form, the code remains unworkable, and if it became law, would hurt not just Google but small publishers, small businesses and the millions of Australians that use our services every day.
Australia makes our rules for things you can do in Australia. That's done in our parliament, it's done by our government, and that's how things work here in Australia. And people who want to work with that in Australia, you're very welcome. But we don't respond to threats.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison there. Well, our correspondent in Sydney, Shaima Khalil, says the proposed law also has the support of the Australian media.
The sharp reaction wasn't just from Scott Morrison against Google. We heard from lawmakers who called the threat to pull out from Australia, blackmailing. Some called it the big companies bullying democracy. The government has been adamant that they want this law to be pushed through to Parliament. They've gained a lot of political support. They've also gained support from media outlets as well, who've really been losing a lot of money in advertising revenue over the years. The government is arguing that because the tech giants like Google, like Facebook, have gained so many consumers, so many customers and people who use their platforms to read the news, billions of dollars in advertising revenue, that they should pay Australian media outlets for their journalism. And this is a very much needed financial avenue for those media outlets that have been losing money. We heard official reports, for example, that say that the Australian print industry has lost 75% of its advertising revenue since 2005. So they're trying to balance this power. They're trying to also introduce a little bit of government oversight in that relationship between the media outlets and the Google, but Google are equally, if not more, resistant, of course.
Well, our senior tech reporter Zoe Kleiman says that the world will be watching carefully because what happens in Australia could set a precedent for other countries.
It's going to be a really interesting one to watch, isn't it? I mean, in a way, Australia isn't really a massive market for Google. You know, it wouldn't harm it hugely to pull out. That said, it made $4 billion Australian dollars out of using its services in Australia last year. So, you know, it is making money out of it. It's kind of become this thing of who blinks first. You've got the Australian PM saying, you know, we make the rules here, not you. You can't blackmail us. And Google saying, well, actually, everybody uses us. You know, you need us. They said they've already last week, this is quite interesting actually, they've already last week piloted blocking news sites to about 1% of Google users. They called it an experiment and said they wanted to see how much difference it made, whether actually these Australian news services were missed. Well, I think Australia will be hoping that they are.
And I guess for Google, the fear is that if Australia go ahead with this, it could set a precedent for other countries.
Exactly right. What's interesting actually is that they've just sat down with France and agreed some sort of thing about how they're going to pay for French media to be used. So, you know, it's not impossible for a deal to be done here. I think much like the media industry, you know, a lot of advertising, digital advertising money is going to big tech now. It's going to Google and to Facebook. Australia's no exception. For every 100 Australian dollars that's spent on digital ads, 81 is going to those companies. So, you know, there's a real sense that smaller and other media is massively losing out. And Australia feels, I think, that it wants to claw some of that back. Some of that big spend needs to come back home.
And Zoe, do we know how the people affected feel about this, the actual users in Australia who may not be able to access Google?
I think there's a really mixed reaction here. You know, some people feel like, well, we need Google, you know, just let them get on with it. They're offering a service that we like, it's familiar, and we've been using it for ages. And time moves on. You know, how long are we going to be able to protect all of these industries that we might have had for a long time, but actually the landscape just doesn't work for them anymore? And of course, there are others who are very loyal, who are saying, you know, this is a huge firm. I said it made 1.4 billion Australian dollars in revenue last year. It paid only about 45 million in tax. Maybe it is about right that that's balance is shifting. Interestingly, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who, as we know, is the inventor of the World Wide Web, well, he has spoken out and said, actually, this isn't fair. This goes completely against the principles of a free internet. You cannot dictate who spends their money where and therefore who gets to be accessible where. That's just not the way the web is meant to work.